Okay, so for day 3 out of the 4 days for this unit of reading and evaluating multiple sources, our objective today is to notice and use primary and secondary sources of information to learn about a topic. So I believe we've covered primary and secondary. But here's what we're going to do. You're going to go ahead and turn and talk with somebody nearby you, and you're going to answer the following questions. What are primary sources, and what are secondary sources? We're going to start there. Go ahead and start.
Primary The secondary source is like it's kind of self-explanatory. It's secondary but there's not
Okay, looks like I see a lot of people stop talking, so they must be done. All right, so let's start with examples, and then we'll go into our answers. So what's an example of a primary source? What do you think, Daniel?
Well, Joe Biden winning? And
So-
then for the secondary source, people might post on stuff that Trump won. What? How's that?
Okay,
Like,
it's not exactly, I think I know what you're kind of getting at, but it's not exactly that. I think you're getting confused with maybe viewpoints and facts, but that's not exactly what a primary source is. So an example of a primary source, Brecken?
you want me to give an example?
Yes, we're still on examples.
Okay, so I think a primary source is, say, geographic.com, that has good resources and stuff that you can use for writing.
So yeah, it is resources. I think would you say geography.com? Geography.com probably has more secondary sources than primary ones. So, but you're on the right track. Primary sources. An example of a primary source could be anything. Think of something that is something really famous that would be considered a primary source. Marcos?
So say you're going to look something up like the history of Joe Biden. You can go to Wikipedia.com and it'll show you a bunch of things and just tell you about his early life. But you can also read books, and the books would be a secondary source because unlike Wikipedia.com, once books are made, they can't have like new stuff added to them.
Okay, so everything that you mentioned is a secondary source. Wikipedia included is a second. Even it doesn't matter. So a secondary source, it doesn't matter if it's continually updated or, like you said, a book that's stuck in time, right? It can't be changed. Both are still secondary sources. So the difference between a secondary and a primary isn't being continually updated. That's not the reason. So the difference between a primary and a secondary. Wesley?
A primary source is the source that you're mainly going to go to first.
Examples.
Oh,
Yeah.
examples.
Stick
Whoops.
with examples for right now.
Sorry. I had the definition, not the example.
But, yep, we'll get there.
Oh,
Daniel?
okay. Not an example.
Newspaper. Yeah.
Okay. A newspaper from, say, 1865. If you were studying, say, the Civil War. So a newspaper from 1865 would be a primary source from that era. Okay? That's an example. What's another example of a primary source, Bracken?
Google.
Google? No, that's a search engine. Google would be a search engine. Another primary source, the Declaration of Independence, would be a primary source. It was written by the people who lived in that time. What's another one? London? Good. So London's saying if she found, it doesn't have to be something world famous, but it could be a note from a time in the past, and for that particular time, that would be a primary source about whatever it is that happened in that era. Like, for example, my grandmother has, from my great-great-grandmother, a diary about the time that she lived. That would be a primary source for the early 1900s. Why? Because you can take the information from there, the way that they saw things, what they did, and you can say, wow, that was what they did during that time. So that would be a primary source. What's another one, Daniel?
If you were studying snowstorms in Antarctica, the people who have experienced head-on would be the primary source, because they've experienced it and they know what it is.
Okay. All right, and then we'll go into secondary sources, but I think we covered that pretty well by some of the examples that you gave. A lot of you gave me secondary sources when you were trying to answer primary sources. So a secondary source is very much like Wikipedia, geography.com, some of the things that you might look up. Because, why? What's the definition of a secondary source? What do you think? What's a secondary source, Zoe?
Maybe something that's in the present time zone?
Not always. So it could be something that's written now about something that happened in the past, sure, but that's not always the case. A secondary source. What is the difference, the key difference between a secondary and a primary? Marcos?
The key difference is that primary sources are like official from the government, or they're more official. Like, for example, you could get a very old newspaper that said something about like a war, but then if you get it from online, that would be secondary source because it's up to you, and also because it will never have the officialness because it never came out during that time.
Okay, so the key difference between a primary source and a secondary source comes down to experience. So a primary source is a primary source because, like Daniel said, they lived in the time that you're studying. So if I was studying, let's say the Civil War, and I found a diary of a soldier from that war, that's a primary source. That is somebody who lived during the Civil War, wrote about what was going on in his or her life at that time. It may not have been necessarily about the war, it could have been about their day, but it is a primary source for that time. Now, if I open up a history book, it doesn't have to be a history book from 2020, or it could have been a history book from the 1960s. If it's writing about the Civil War, it is a secondary source, because it is a person who did not live during the Civil War. Whether it be a person from the 1960s or a person from 2020, doesn't matter. Neither of those people lived during the Civil War. Therefore, they are both secondary sources. Okay? So it doesn't matter when the post or the book or whatever came out. What matters is did the writer live during that time? And did the writer write about that stuff? If they didn't, then it's not a primary source. Okay? If they didn't live during that time, if they didn't experience it, it can't be a primary source. It's like me writing about World War II. Did I experience World War II? No. Therefore, whatever I write about World War II is going to be a secondary source. It can't be primary. If some of you have a great-great-granddad that was alive during that time and served, their experience would be a primary source. What they went through is a primary source because they lived it. They were there. That's the difference between a primary and secondary. London? Very cool. So you could maybe argue that's a primary source for whenever that person was alive writing. So yeah, that's another good example. So sometimes people make time capsules. I don't know if you ever heard of that before. You take stuff from that year and you put it in a box and you bury it, and then maybe somebody finds it 50 years later. If they find it 50 years later, you could argue that's a primary source for whatever year you buried it for, because that's information about the time that you lived in, right? Second? Yeah. Very cool. That would be a primary source as well. It's an artifact, right, from that time. Okay. So let's think about this activity here. In the next few slides, we're going to see primary and secondary sources about Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. I want you to be looking for differences between the primary and secondary sources, and be ready to share your thoughts when we create our chart. So let's go ahead and look at these. So, Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. So that was the words of Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Okay, here's another source. We'll get to it in a second, Daniel, so just kind of wait through. Here's another source. MLK, I Have a Dream speech. The source is the picture itself. Okay, this is the source. So be thinking, is that a primary or is that a secondary? Here's another picture. Is this primary or is this secondary? Thinking. And then we have one more text. I Have a Dream by Amy, I believe it's Tikanen. I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. that was delivered on August 28, 1963 during the March on Washington. A call for equality and freedom. It became one of the defining moments of the Civil Rights Movement and one of the most iconic speeches in American history. Some 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. for the March on Washington. The one-day event both protested racial discrimination and encouraged the passage of civil rights legislation. At the time, the Civil Rights Act was being discussed in Congress. The march featured various speeches as well as musical performance before King. A celebrated orator appeared as the final official speaker. A. Philip Randolph and Benjamin Mays ended the proceedings with a pledge and a benediction, respectively. Early in his prepared speech, King referenced Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address with 50 years ago. He then spoke about the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended the long night of their captivity. However, he continued by noting that African Americans were still not free and that they were crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. Okay, so thinking.
I have a question.
All right, what's your question?
Why did it say 50 years ago when it was 47?
You're right. It's supposed to be a reference back because nobody talks. It's famous because it says 40, so when you say 50, probably one of the first things you're going to think of is the Emancipation Proclamation. So it has the same wording, even though it doesn't have the same number. So that's why it's supposed to be a callback. So let's compare sources. Primary source, written or recorded by someone who witnessed a historical event. Secondary source, written by someone who did not witness the event. Okay, so which one was a primary source? Let's start there. Daniel?
It says.
Of the sources we just read, which ones were primary? Or saw, I guess.
The second one?
So just, okay, I can't really tell you, what's the second one
The one that you read second.
that I read second? So the
Left,
Amy,
left. Amy.
that's a primary source. So that's a person who written or recorded by someone who witnessed a historical event. So you're saying she was there.
Did she say that she wasn't there?
No, but did she say that she did?
Did it sound like she was there?
I guess so, the first one then.
Okay. So, Zoe?
I was just gonna say the first one.
Okay, Martin Luther King's speech, right? Because we read that at the very first one, right? I told you that was Martin Luther King Jr. himself. So, MLK's speech.
Wasn't the first one though just someone writing down everything he said?
Yes.
No, he wrote the speech and was reading it.
Oh.
So, it is, obviously, even if he had spoken it and they just recorded it, it would still be a primary source, right? So obviously MLK was there, or else it wouldn't really be much of a speech, right? Because he's the one that spoke it.
No, it's like
So
after his famous
his speech
it's
is a
like-
primary source. What's another primary source that was there?
Oh, primary. I was thinking of secondary.
Okay,
one.
Amelia?
The first picture?
Yeah, the picture. The picture had MLK there, right? And everybody else. It's by a photographer who obviously was there, right? Or else they wouldn't have gotten the picture. So, picture of MLK Jr. Okay, what about the source, the secondary sources? Bracken?
That drawing.
Okay, so a drawing of I Have a Dream. And then what was the other one that was a secondary source, Zoe?
The one that Amy told us about?
Okay. Amy's writing. Okay, so let's compare the writings for a second. Amy's writing compared to MLK Jr.'s writing. How did it feel as I was reading through it? How did it feel? So, how did it feel as far as the words that were being said about the speech? Or, obviously, MLK Jr.'s speech itself? Reckon?
It didn't really sound like he was there.
Yeah, and how do you make, so where do you get that conclusion from? That it didn't sound like she was there, Brecken?
He kept saying like
Yeah, there you go. So she would be saying it differently. Sounds like she got her information on a website. What else makes it sound like it's more secondary than primary? London?
Because she said like Martin Luther King's story every day, not Martin Luther King's story, so she wasn't actually there.
Okay. So past tense could be used, right, as a clue that maybe this person wasn't there and it's a secondary source. What else? Zoe?
He did like itty bitty parts of like quotings from them, so I would say that kind of proves that she wasn't there. She just did a little bit from like probably upstairs.
It feels very informational, right? Like you're sitting down with somebody and they're just kind of spitting out facts left and right, right? Most of the time when we talk about primary sources, they're living it. It's in the moment. They're not very textbook or informational, sitting there kind of saying, well, there were 250,000 people there, and then there was this, and then there was that, and then you may call back to this. You know, and it's not like that usually when you're speaking with somebody who's living in the moment. Do you sound that way when you're living in your moments in life? Probably not. So, very good, Brecken. Yeah, it's very informational feeling, right? Lots of facts, very textbooky. What about MLK Jr.'s speech? Because his is a primary source. So what's the difference then? How did he word his, and how did it feel compared to Amy's? Because in hers, it's very informational and all of that, and you know, talking about the speech and the implications of it and all that. What about MLK Jr.'s speech itself? Amelia?
So it sounded like, well, in contrast, Amy sounded more like a story, where she
Mhm.
was telling it and relaying it to us. And whenever he said something, it's like, he said, or he did this, but in Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, he didn't say anything like, he said, or he did, or this happened.
Yep. London?
Um,
Oh, sorry. I thought you were done.
So it wasn't like he was retelling a story. He was actually doing it.
Yeah, so it doesn't feel like a retelling. That's good. What else can we use to kind of figure out, the difference between a primary and a secondary? London?
He didn't say like then I said this. He just pulled out instead of like telling you what he said.
Okay, good. What else, Lila?
I thought somebody else said, instead of someone else writing it, it says he said and he thought, but since it's his, he said I said.
Yeah, so it's more I, so good. Zoe?
It made it sound like, compared to hers at least, it made it sound like he was actually talking to you instead of somebody just telling you all facts straight. It just sounded like he was actually having a conversation with people.
Good, yeah, so it sounds like he's actually talking to you. Sometimes when we find letters that are primary sources, it might not be talking to you, it might be talking to somebody else, like dear, whatever, whoever they're writing to. But yeah, it sounds like a conversation rather than textbook. What else, Brecken?
If you were actually there, they wouldn't just be talking about like, well, this and this happened. They would be saying, oh, it was such a nice thing what happened. They're saying because I think that sound like they're talking like process stuff. Like this was one of the biggest things when if you were actually there, you've seen how like great it was.
Yeah, if you're living in the moment, you're probably going to give more of a review, a feedback, right? How great it was, and that sort of thing, rather than giving out facts about, well, the speech did this, and it affected this, and Congress did this. Yeah, very good. Also, primary sources tend to live in the moment. The person writing it, they don't know the future. They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know if this speech is going to actually make a difference in anything. They're living in the moment. So if you were to ask somebody who was there, like Brecken said, probably would say it was nice, I hope Congress was listening, you know, they might be saying something like that. Where if somebody like Amy is writing, she knows the future, she knows what happened next. They say hindsight is 20/20, right? You can look back and say, oh yeah, if I had done this, this would have happened, this would have been better. So you can see that as a difference too. Primary sources, they tend to speak with passion in what they believe in, and they don't really know what's going to happen next. They just kind of live in that moment. It's kind of the same thing where if we look back at elections, so presidential elections and that sort of thing, you will see that if you find primary sources, people are usually very passionate and living in the moment. And then if you read secondary sources about that election, it's very informational. So-and-so said this, the electorate didn't like it, so his popularity went down, you know, that kind of thing. They're very, very informational, fact-based, instead of living in that moment, just like the person who was there is very passionate about it. So passion is usually another difference between primary and secondary. Okay, so as you're reading today, I'd like you to just be thinking about, does your book include any primary or secondary sources? And if it does, write it in your mini lesson response today. And that's all. Okay, we're going to stop the video.